Welcome everybody. My name is Christian Hyatt, and today we're going to talk a little bit about penetration testing, especially some, new phishing techniques that were brought to my attention by Renegade's lab team, especially Asher here, who's going to introduce themselves in a second. And the purpose of today's talk is we're going to live demo how this phishing exercise works, and also talk about some remediation steps for the organization if this is something you're concerned with. So Ash, thanks for joining us today. I'm gonna pass it on to you to kind of do your thing, and I'll be chiming in with some questions as we go. So let's do
Cool.
it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Like Christian mentioned, I'm Andree. I'm a senior analyst here, penetration tester at Renegade Labs, which is Risk360's branch of the business, interested in anything related to offensive security, so penetration testing, red teaming, and pretty much anything in between. I went ahead and listed members of our team. So you've got myself, Ryan, who's the manager, and also Graham, another operator here performing penetration testing. So before we begin too, I wanted to go ahead and list some references. So like anything, before we get into the meat of the discussion, a lot of this, what we'll be talking about today, is built upon some awesome work by some really talented people. So I've mentioned a few. You can go ahead and reference them. I want to give them credit. A lot of the hard work is and research is performed by these folks. So I'm really just showing you how it works. Yeah, so for context, when we had some internal trainings times with the whole team that we have on a regular cadence at Risk360, and I was trying to think of a topic, and kind of came up with this diagram, which is, as you can tell, super complicated. So I'll break it down. Essentially, I realized, as a penetration tester, it's a can be technical, pretty technical topic, and generally, I've found with prior experience that as the nerdiness factor increases, the general audience's fun typically decreases, as you can tell. So my goal was to find something in this nice middle point, and what that led me to was talking about phishing.
So you had to dumb it down for us, the folks that aren't quite as smart as you. This is a great intersection. I've heard this talk. It is a fantastic intersection of highly interesting and also technical and actionable. So thank you.
That's right. Yeah. So I've definitely made some eyes glaze over before. So hopefully that won't happen. But yeah, I mean, it led me to phishing, specifically, like we'll talk about Office 365 phishing techniques, and actually a specific attack that I think is super cool. So first off,
and just to give it away,
yeah.
so everyone kind of know what we're here to talk about. Specifically, you're going to demo an Office 365 exploit that can bypass multi-factor authentication and ultimately give a hacker access to an end user's Office 365 environment, all the data within, and if you were to execute this attack against someone who has administrative access, it could bypass MFA and really give someone access to the entire organization. So if that sounds interesting to you guys and you're using Office 365 and you're concerned, we're going to demo exactly how that works in some remediation here.
Yep, for sure. And yeah, like you said, I probably should have led with that. That's definitely the icing on the cake, the end result. So this attack really, it can be compromised into three basic steps, but I'll start with essentially why you should be interested and why you would want to know. So for us internally, we use Office 365. It's part of our regular business functions, like many organizations. Also, our clients use it, so it's really important that we're up to date on techniques that are used in the real world to attack it, and also the world heavily uses it. So I was doing a little bit of research on kind of the market share, and it seems like most reports put O365 at around a 40% market share, which is a lot. And then I think G Suite, or I guess Google Workspaces now, takes like the remaining 60% of that. So definitely a massive footprint. Like from my perspective, it's really important to know how to interact with various sorts of technology from a attacker's mindset, and then for I know a lot of you watching, it's probably, well, hey, I use this. How can I defend from phishing attacks, especially those that are kind of up and coming?
Yep. And one thing you mentioned was, and I've heard others say, is, from a hacker's perspective, if you want to develop exploits around something, you want to develop exploits around something that has a huge audience and is widely used, and that you have a lot of opportunity to use. And when something has 40% of the market share, that presents a huge opportunity for exploits. So that's an important factor, and I think why you chose to dedicate some time to learn about this, and why it's so popular and for hackers, and to potentially try to use this technique.
Yep, definitely. And yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say if anybody rolls out any environment that handles mail, you're going to be receiving phishing attacks pretty commonly. So keeping ahead of that is definitely really important. Cool. So what do you need to know to understand the attack? Well, it'll probably help to understand the name. This specific phishing technique is something called the illicit consent grant attack, which you might be thinking, what the heck is that? I'll definitely explain it. Other research and documentation on this attack might refer to it as like the malicious Office 365 app attack, or maybe the malicious grant attack. But I've seen this name used, and I like it the best because it kind of talks about the root of the problem, which is your users in Office 365 by default are able to grant external apps access to your environment, which we'll talk about, and we'll talk about the implications of that. And essentially, all you need to know to understand how this works is three main things. So obviously you need to know what is Office 365, what are the apps, and then pretty much just how does it work. And then that's whenever we will cross our fingers and hope the demo works successfully. So yeah, it's pretty simple actually, the groundwork, but the attack's pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and start hitting those bullet points on the right as far as what you need to know. So starting with Office 365, chances are if you clicked on this, you probably already have a decent knowledge about this, but I included just some quick references on the timeline of Microsoft's service model for SharePoint and Office products, all the way leading up to, you can see right in 2012 here, Office 365's official launch. I think the beta was sometime in like 2010. So essentially, it's just a platform that organizations can use to do business. So email, document storage, document sharing, and everything in between. It's grown at a crazy rate, right? So fast forward 2021, I think the majority of organizations use it to some extent. You can see back here nested, I kind of poorly cropped this, but I think this was somewhere from like 2013 to 2020, the user base, which I'm sure has actually grown at a larger rate because of COVID. So you see like 258 million monthly active users. So it's pretty safe to say that adversaries are going to target this sort of thing on a regular basis due to that amount of usage. So yeah, it's pretty. The Office 365 Gambit is made up by a lot of different technologies. We're really going to be focusing on the idea of applications within Office 365. So I know Christian and I both have smartphones, right? And on smartphones, you can install applications through an app store type functionality, whether you're using like an iPhone or an Android. It's pretty similar. That same idea was implemented in Office 365 by Microsoft. It's the ability, it creates the ability for developers to create applications, maybe for their company, maybe for their service, and integrate it into their customer's environment. Maybe there's a cool tool that's really simple, something like Calendly, for example, helps you schedule calendar invites. they might have an Office 365 application. You can go and grab that and basically install it into your Office 365 environment. And some really smart people basically found that that creates a environment where that sort of functionality can be abused by attackers. Whenever that installation or acceptance happens, there's actually like a back-end authorization taking place that's basically your user saying, hey, I see this application, I'm granting it access to a specific set of data, and once that grant is completed, the application owner can do some specific steps, and their application can view that data. So hopefully I explained that pretty straightforward. I think it'll make more sense in the coming examples. But functionally, what this looks like is pretty much just this prompt on the left. So you can see there's a permission requested prompt. So whenever the user visits this application, they want to install it inside of their environment. They receive this prompt, which is basically them granting the application access to their environment. And you can see there's all sorts of data that this particular app is requesting. And then on the back end, what actually designates what type of data the application is requesting is all based on something called the Microsoft Graph API. So essentially, you don't really need to worry about what this is too much. You can just think of it as the hook that ties an application to an Office 365 environment. So I know, Christian, you talked about in the beginning, attackers can use this phishing technique to view all information within an environment. While that is necessarily true, Microsoft has done some recent work to, by default, require administrative consent to certain requests. So what I've found is that by default, certain types of data can be granted access by a typical user, although more privileged pieces of information do require admin consent, which I think we'll get to more in more detail in the back half of the talk. So essentially, how this attack works is an attacker creates their malicious app. So like you can see in this slide, on the right here, they'll create their app. They'll set up some permissions that are requested with the application. And then once that's spun up, there are specific ways to create links that you can send out to your victims. Now, we'll kind of skip the whole phishing methodology. I could talk about that for hours and hours, but for the purposes of this talk, you can pretty much assume that a successful phishing email has landed in the employee's inbox, and they've clicked on the link. So once they click on the link, they're again brought to a similar page, just like this one on the left, where they're prompted by the application to accept permissions, or grant permissions, I should say, into the environment. Should they click accept, and they have the correct permissions to grant access, at that point the application is essentially hooked into the environment. And if the attacker plays their cards right, they can use that hook to persist within the environment, which again I'll show you how that works. It's pretty cool. And then once they're hooked in the environment, any data that was requested, so like maybe the user's contact information, maybe the user's email address, maybe if they're an admin, other people's emails or chat messages, something like that. At that point, the attacker can use that Graph API to gather all that information under the context of that user. So there's kind of a lot of moving parts. But it's interesting to see how it works in reality, because it definitely is a pretty unique attack. So I want to talk a little bit too, just about relevance too. I was trying to figure out when this officially started, quotation marks, because it seems like something that would have been picked up pretty soon after the launch of Office 365. However, I just did some Googling, and it looks like right around December 2019 timeframe, a couple different blogs got published, like I think by Fish Labs was one of them, that talk about this attack specifically. Obviously, phishing attacks against O365 is super prevalent and probably has been since its inception, but this specific technique seems like it's right around that time frame when it popped up in the news, which is pretty cool from my perspective because it seems like it's, I mean, 2019 might seem really far away, but it's actually pretty new in terms of Microsoft products. So, and then just more about the relevance recently. Actually, yeah, May 5th, 2021, you can see that Krebs on Security posted about this specific technique. If you're familiar with security bloggers, that name might ring a bell. He's pretty popular, and usually whenever he is blogging about something or talking about something, it's pretty safe to say that it's actively being exploited in the wild, and it's pretty prevalently being used by real-world adversaries. And then kind of layered behind that, sorry about the cropping here, but you can see that the SolarWinds breach, which made a bunch of news if you're following the security space at all, their CEO came out and confirmed that Office 365 likely played a part in the initial breach. So the attackers might have used maybe not this technique, but a similar technique to target the environment, and then used that access to further pivot to other resources and maybe other attack avenues. So all in all, attackers targeting Office 365 is definitely here to stay. I don't see it going anywhere. It's definitely following the way organizations are moving. So this attack is super important, and honestly pretty important to be able to protect yourself against.
Awesome. So,
Yeah.
Ash, I know you're about to jump into the demo here, but just to summarize, so what you're about to show us in this demo is basically how a malicious actor can create an Office 365 application, an unverified one. They can leverage a phishing email to send someone this malicious application. If the end user decides to confirm or attempt to install this malicious application, that in turn will perhaps give the hacker, access to different types of data in the Office 365 environment and bypass MFA based on whatever you as the malicious actor set up the application to try to gather. And that's the nuts and bolts of this. And you're going to show us like how this works in the real world, and then we'll talk about some remediation steps. So
Yeah.
let's do that.
Cool. Let's do it. So I will jump over to a couple different windows here, and this is basically just prepping the environment and giving some contextual information. So this window on the right is basically under the context of our victim user. So you can put your victim user hat on whenever you see me over here on the right. Essentially, I'm logged in. You can pretend I'm doing my day-to-day work. You can see me logged in here to Office. Although this one is a little light, this is a test environment, so I'm not actually paying for like Outlook or anything. I don't have a subscription. But you can pretty much summarize this on the right as your day-to-day user logged into their web browser using Office 365 apps during their day-to-day housekeeping activities, work, that sort of thing. And the user's name is phishme at this domain. So anytime you see this user in action, you can assume it's the victim. And then what I've done on the right here is logged in as an admin, and this will actually come into play in a little bit whenever we perform the attack. Cool. So I'm going to move over here to my hacker screen, I call it. So whenever you see this text, you don't necessarily have to worry about what's going on. You can just assume that, okay, we're the attacker, we're the hacker, and we're trying to exploit this victim. I won't explain to too much detail what's actually happening here, but again, shout out to Black Hills and specifically Bo or Daft Hack. A lot of the tool sets I'll be using are written by him, open source tool sets. So just automating a lot of the attack processes. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I will go ahead and grab a link really quick. And what we'll do is we'll say, okay, we're the attacker. We've received the phishing email. Again, that's the attacker on the right. And we're going to click on the link and see where that takes us. So let's go ahead and drop that link in our browser, which we've authenticated to as the victim user. And that will push us to a verification screen. So before we get into the weeds here,
so what would have happened here, Ash, I think is what you're saying is,
yeah,
someone would have sent a phishing email, and that email, it would have had that link in it, like saying, confirm that you want to use this app. You click on that link, and it would take you to this permission request page. Is that right?
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it.
And I did want to state too that this user has MFA enabled, and since they've already signed in to Office, they're shot immediately to this link that was sent to them through the phishing email. However, if they haven't authenticated, it'll actually push them to Microsoft's authentication page, and which is pretty cool because it helps this stay under the radar. And we'll talk about this later, but actually distinguishing between malicious and normal use case applications is interesting down the road. But yep, safe to say the user has clicked on the phishing link and they're brought to this permission screen. There's a few things I'll note here. So the first thing is the name of the application. So I've named my malicious app. Again, I'm the attacker, right? So I've named the malicious app Risk360 Integrations. You can name that whatever you want. And then you can see that the application is unverified. So you can see the date I created, you can see its actual URL, and then you can see the name of it. Pretty simple. Well, that brings up the topic of verified and unverified applications. Microsoft has this concept of verifying your application using this ID value. It's kind of similar to like on the App Store, right? You'll have a verified publisher of an application whenever you install it. It's really similar, and essentially what that means for us as an attacker is certain permissions will always require admin consent. Or an administrator will get a notification that, hey, one of your users is trying to grant this application access, and they'll have to go and basically verify that for the end user. Now, as an attacker, you can get around this a little bit. There's certain permissions that actually don't require an administrator to grant consent to. So this is a case of one of those for the sake of the demo. So I've configured this specifically to only request permissions that any user can grant access to, and that'll make this a little bit easier. So you can see that,
Ash, one thing we talked about is there's some speculation about if there's going to be a black market for verified IDs. So that if you're a hacker, you could potentially like get a malicious app that is verified. Anyway, for the point of this demo, you did it unverified, but
yeah,
there's situations where even a verified app could be malicious.
Right. Yeah, that would be a really interesting use case, because then it would basically put this back to square zero, like the first step. For reference too, I think the date is November 9th, 2020, whenever that unverified kind of control was put in place by Microsoft. So as far as I'm aware, before that time period, it was kind of uncontrolled by default, which is really interesting. Yeah. So moving on, we'll basically take a look at what permissions it's requesting. So there's some drop-down arrows, but essentially it's just the application is requesting for the victim user to grant it access to sign in as the user, read the profile data, and then maintain any access to data that the application is requesting. So a lot of words there, but essentially this is just for lack of going into it too deep, just some basic user permissions to view some basic data within the environment. I also wanted to highlight just like the whole user experience of this whole process. So, you can pretend you're the victim user. It's, Friday afternoon. You're ready to get off for the weekend. You receive an email that's, really well constructed. It looks legit, and maybe it's, hey, click on this link so we can get our accounting numbers pushed through with this cool new app. You're tired. You just want to get done. You get to this page, and this blue accept button looks pretty enticing, right? I know, like, I do it myself. Sometimes you're just clicking through prompts, right? You just need to get this thing installed or get this thing done. So I think all in all, this is pretty convincing, and the fact that it's literally an actual Microsoft page is really cool for an attacker, right? So let's go ahead and click accept, and what that is going to do is grant the malicious application access to our environment. Once we click that, it's going to redirect us to a fake page. So this is actually the fake phishing portal that I've made using some open source tool sets, namely one called Zfisher. But you don't actually have to worry about this too much because it actually doesn't play a part in this attack at all. So this page could literally be anything. I've just chose to make it look legit for the sake of the demo, but you can redirect the user to your app, and that app can be, like I said, whatever you want. So what's interesting is, like I said, that our victim user has MFA, but that hasn't played a part in this process at all. And effectively, at this point, the attack is complete from the perspective of the user. So we'll go back to our hacker screen. And what I'll do is cat out the data from the victim. Now, again, you don't need to worry too much about the contents here. Again, also huge shout out to Bo from Black Hills. A lot of this stuff is directly from examples he gave in training. So, but also examples that are super prevalent in the real world. And what I'll do is I'll grab this token. And this token is essentially what grants us access to the environment as the user. And I'll grab my notes here, and we'll hop over to my PowerShell window. And I'm going to show you how an attacker could take this OAuth token that, again, is provided once the application is hooked, and then use that to generate an access token, which is a little bit different. And that access token can essentially be used to authenticate as the user. So I'm just going to run a couple scripts here. And boom, you can see that on the right here, we've got a new access token and we've got a new refresh token. I understand this probably looks like a bunch of gibberish too, but the reason this is important is this allows us to use all those permissions we requested in a subsequent attack. So I'm just going to throw this into an additional command using Bo's tool set. And then if we run that, we can see that we are officially authenticated as PhishMe, which again is our victim user. And you can see a whole bunch of information, which I have not filled out just because it's a test environment. But should this be a real environment, you'd probably see the user's email address, maybe their phone number, the location, and some other information within the environment. But the important thing is that we are officially acting as the victim user and authenticated into their victim environment rather than our own attacker environment. So the other thing that's really cool about this is the fact that that token, which has a really short lifespan, can actually be recreated, as far as I know, endlessly. So you'll notice that up here, past all this gibberish, there's this access token, but there's also this refresh token, and that can be used to create a new access token. The access tokens are typically short-lived, like I think either an hour or maybe even less than that, if I remember correctly. So it's really important as an attacker to handle that data very carefully, because you might not get another shot, right, at getting access to an environment. So again, I'm going to be using another script from one of Daft Hack's toolsets, and what that'll let me do, if I copy it correctly, is, generate fresh tokens. And should this be executed in the real world by an attacker, they would likely script this whole process out, have those tokens automatically be refreshed, and therefore the persistence within the environment could last for an extremely long time until detection happens. And then that access could be, again, used to perform other enumeration based on what they requested.
Yeah, Ash, I think some of the bottom lines I'm seeing here, from a non-technical user perspective, is one, bypassing MFA, which is huge because there's a sense of security if you have MFA enabled in your organization. And then two, the ability to maintain persistent access. So even if the end user changes their password or does different things, you can generate new access tokens to ultimately persistent access. And those are two really big deals in terms of security and your ability to secure your own environment. So very cool.
Yeah.
So Ash, can we talk a little bit about, I know you're still wrapping up some of this stuff here, but I'd love to get into like remediation items and things like that as well.
For sure. Yeah. I'll go ahead and blow this up here. This is my window that's authenticated to the victim environment as an admin. So we'll go ahead and say, hey, we want to remediate this. We're an admin in the victim environment. Remediation for this attack is kind of interesting. There's some built-in mitigations that Microsoft has provided, although there's caveats to them because some of them aren't enabled by default, which if you've worked with Microsoft products for a while, that might trigger some PTSD or something, but it seems to be the case as well with certain things in Azure, a lot of which a lot of the configurations that make up the environment. I guess we'll start with the most important one, which is, hey, I'm hooked. Like, we just hooked that malicious app and granted access to the environment. How do I get rid of it? Maybe you're thinking, hey, I have like a bunch of apps that I know I don't need and I'm concerned about them. How do I get rid of them? We are logged in here as, like I said, as the admin. And what you can do is you can go to the enterprise applications portion of the Azure portal. And what you'll notice is that in this listing, there's this Risk 360 integrations application, which, if you notice the name, it's the application we just hooked into the environment. And essentially, all you'll need to do is click on it, go to the Properties tab, which you can just quickly jump to right here, and click Delete. And at that point, the application can no longer grant access or use their access to persist within the environment. However, if I remember correctly, I think the access token actually still exists for the user, which is interesting. So that brings us to some Microsoft guidance. I read through the Microsoft remediation steps, and it's funny, one of the things that they talk about is actually having your users do like a self-serve access review, which I thought was really interesting. The other portion of where that application is hooked is within a user's application listing, which is a little bit separate from the enterprise applications. So if you go to the specific user, and I went to the one that we fished, originally that application would have been listed in here as an application that that user granted access to. So the users can also themselves um, delete the application from the environment, except it doesn't delete it completely, which it's still tied to the environment itself.
So
So a
just
little.
for context, we did the same exercise like at Risk 360 to kind of see what in there. There's even at a small company, sometimes dozens of applications that aren't intuitively named, so you don't know the implications for deleting stuff. The other thing you just pointed out is if the user deletes it out of their application list, the hacker still can maintain persistent access. You have to go to the enterprise applications level to delete that out, which is not 100% intuitive, so you can't really rely on the user to self-audit themselves. It has to be deleted at the enterprise level. Is that right, Ash?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's a better synopsis of it. Um, I will say too, as a kind of protective measure, should you encounter a place where you have a decent level of confidence that a user has been hooked through this method, you can actually just disable the user, and then that way all their access tokens will no longer work. That's the complete measure without a doubt that fixes a active incident where this is occurring. However, I do think that would be a rare occurrence because you'd have to, really take a deep dive into your logs and see how this is playing. So, as a protective measure, cleaning up this enterprise applications list is like definitely your go-to.
Great. So we have a couple steps. One, we can do some audits on our enterprise application list and clean that up periodically. If we suspect something's happened, we can disable the user, and that will get rid of access. Are there any preventative things you mentioned early on that you can require an admin or something to approve applications? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep, for sure. So this brings us back to what I was talking about earlier with the verified and the unverified concept of the applications. So when an application is not verified, certain permissions require admin consent. But you can just require admin consent for everything, which is actually what I typically recommend for organizations. Um, Christian, I know you mentioned like with live prod environments, you have hundreds and hundreds in some cases enterprise applications, but really to effectively manage that list, you want to include it in your asset inventory, perform regular checks on that listing to make sure it's matching up with what's approved, and therefore it's really a no-brainer to make sure that some sort of approval process is happening for this in every case.
Yeah, I want to point out we did learn a couple things. Um, one thing that I learned as we were implementing this step is I was surprised at the number of like everyday use tools have an application associated with them. We had some end users that used like a Samsung phone, and there was a few apps called like Samsung Email, and you can imagine if you have thousands of users that are trying to connect email to their phone, there could be applications associated with them getting in there, and so you could overwhelm an administrator with permissions that they need to grant. So that's like a careful balance of, do you require every application to be approved? How do they know? How does the admin know if it should be approved? What's the cost associated with creating a bottleneck and perhaps limiting productivity versus the very real security threat of a malicious application coming through too?
Yeah.
So like with everything in security, there's this balance of security and convenience. So you're gonna have to really take that seriously, which is why this is a great hack, because it really makes you have to make that decision: do I keep myself exposed or do I close this gap with a preventative control like you're pointing out here? And there's no good answer on that, which
Yeah,
is great for guys like you who want an app to maintain persistence and executability, I guess.
definitely, definitely.
Awesome. Well,
Yep.
Ash, thanks, man. I think great demo showing us how this could be done. I think this is a very real threat to organizations, especially, as Office 365 gets more and more market share. We've talked about a little bit of remediation in terms of perhaps requiring approvals for different types of applications, doing regular audits of those applications, and then if there is a breach situation, don't just delete the app. Go ahead and probably disable the user if you can track it down to a specific user.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. If you guys watching this enjoyed this kind of materials, you can check out our YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube and search for Risk 360. We have a whole playlist on Renegade Labs. We put out content like this all the time. We're trying to provide some examples on real world threats and remediation items. You can also reach out to Ash or Ryan on our team, and we're happy to help. So thanks again, Ash. I appreciate it.